We're now broadcasting a tribute in words and music to a great English woman born 100 years ago on April the 23rd, Ethel Smyth. The narrator is Denis Quilley.
And in our opening pages, Sir Thomas Beecham records a tribute to this most distinguished of women composers.
One of the most vivid of my recollections, in fact, very living indeed, is my first encounter with Ethel Smyth. I use the word encounter instead of the ordinary phrase getting in touch with or meeting, because there was something militant, belligerent about Ethel that differentiated her strongly from any other member of her sex that I've ever known. I don't mean to say I haven't seen other militant and belligerent females. I have up and down the world, mostly in America, where they abound. But not one of them has been in the same street as Ethel or can be compared with her. She was an absolute portent of activity, physical and mental. She was on the go from morning till night, and I suspect from the greater part of night till morning. She swam into my ken when I was giving for the first time anywhere the whole of a mass of life of Delius. She was very taken with it. She liked the music of Delius. And she came to me in very excited state. She said, "You have got to conduct my opera, The Wreckers." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, do you know anything about my opera?" I said, "Oh, yes, I know a great deal about it. Don't you like it?" I said, "Well, I might like it if I knew it a little better than I do at the moment." She said, "You shall know it better. Will you come and see me? And I'll go through it with you." She did. She played the whole piece through, mostly the wrong notes, but still with a vigor and élan that was really very inspiriting. And I couldn't help saying at the end, "Well, yes, I really do like it, you know. And you sure you want me to conduct it?" "I do." I said, "Right, I will." Well, it would take me something like a small book to recount faithfully all that happened during the preparation and performances of the records. Ethel Smyth was not in one place at the same time. She was in 2 and 3 and 4 places at the same time. I made her personality felt throughout the theater, outside the theater, with the press, and in society. Society then was a very important factor in British life. And Ethel, who had not only respectable, but well-connected relations, devoted a good deal of her energies to securing a fashionable audience for the performances of the records, which was given at His Majesty's Theatre. I can't tell you very much about it, except that it was an exciting affair. And I can only remember one thing, and that occurred during one of the final rehearsals when I was whipping up the orchestra to a frenzy of effort. It was about the time when the 2 lovers who'd been guilty of some offense against the social morality of Cornwall at the time, a county that was almost entirely populated by wreckers, scoundrels, thugs, and other people who ought to be either transported or hanged. This amiable couple were going to be drowned alive. And the tenor, who was John Coates, at a moment stepped forward and said to me, Tell me, are we going to be drowned with the sea or by your orchestra?" Well, I said, "John, if you can't sing any better than you're singing now, you're going to be drowned by my orchestra pretty quick, too. So you can take your choice." Well, anyway, the records was really a success in a way. So much so that Ethel's wealthy and fashionable relations induced King Edward VII to come to one of the performances, a matinee. And His Majesty came. And he was very gracious. And he almost kissed Ethel. He certainly shook me by the hand. I don't think he actually succeeded in kissing Ethel. No man within my recollection ever has succeeded, or did succeed, in kissing Ethel. But afterwards, in fact later on in the evening at the supper party, I asked the King's secretary what His Majesty thought about the piece. He said, I don't know what he thought about it. I said, but he must have said something. Oh yes, he said something. It was about 3/4 of the way through, and he woke up suddenly and said, Fritz, this is Fritz Swansby, said, it's the 4th time that infernal noise has roused me. Well, after that, my friendship, I think I can call it so, with Ethel pursued a fairly even course. But unfortunately, she was diverted from the broad course of composition into politics and revolutionary activity. This activity took the form of becoming a leader of the suffragette movement. And into that she threw herself with the same excitement, vigor, and industry as she did into all things of an artistic kind. She led processions, she made speeches, she thumped many tubs here and there, and finally distinguished herself by throwing bricks through the dining room or drawing room windows of cabinet ministers. After a while, this was tolerated for a little while, but after a while it became too much of a habit to be encouraged. And so Ethel was, as they would say today, pinched, or in more classic English, arrested, tried and convicted, and sent to Holloway prison to reflect and, if possible, repent, where she neither reflected nor repented. She pursued the joyously rowdy line of activity. Accompanying her were about a dozen other suffragettes, for whom Ethel wrote a stirring march song of freedom. And on one occasion, I went to see her. Well, as a matter of fact, I went to see her several times. But on this particular occasion, when I arrived, the warden of the prison, was a very amiable fellow, was bubbling with laughter. He said, come into the quadrangle. There were the ladies, a dozen ladies, marching up and down, singing hard, and he pointed up to a window where Ethel appeared, was leaning out, conducting with a toothbrush, also with immense vigor, and joining in the chorus of her own song. Shout, come with the sound, ride with the wind, all the dawn is breaking, march, march, swing your love, wind through the banner and hope is waiting, song with its glory, lift with the glory, through the world, and land is the one, land, golden and fair, the dawn of freedom, the voice of the Lord. Well, this was an unfortunate diversion, really, because Ethel was a composer in a certain way of originality. Not only of originality, but she was a composer of spirit, vigor, with a talent for emphasis, accent, or what you might vulgarly call guts. Qualities or merits that were not shared by many composers of the time in England. Our composers, for most part, have been a placid, contemplative, and dreamy lot, and it requires a deuce of a lot to wake them up. Well, everything that Ethel did was quite otherwise. And in fact, some of the most spirited music of that time was written by Ethel. In the records, portions of A Boatswain's Mate, and most of all in a piece that I regret have never recorded at the time, and should be recorded, called Hey Nolly No. This is a setting of an old song, a glee perhaps, which was discovered in the library of Christ Church at Oxford. When the bells of death do ring, hey nolly no. That is almost the most vigorous composition in English musical literature I know. Well, fortunately for her, if not for the rest of the world, the Great War arrived in 1914 and put a stop to the efforts of the suffragettes. Ethel turned once again to composition and produced a very charming light opera, The Boatswain's Mate. She made, however, a serious aesthetic blunder here. The first part of it, the first act, is almost ideal, divided between songs and choruses and dialogue. But in the second part, she went all Wagnerian. So we have everything, including dialogue, set to music, which I think was a mistake. However, it is a jolly piece. It has originality, even if some of the themes are borrowed from good models, and might well suffer a revival. Well, so Ethel went on and on and on, never losing her spirits and her industry, but sobering a good deal down in the political way. And I think the culminating point of her life and achievement was sometime in the early 30s, when, in conjunction with others, notably my friends Hugh Allen, we organized a festival for her, several concerts, Queen's Hall, and occasions elsewhere. That was, I think, the last great event in her career, and she was just the same. She never altered. Ethel had a good many friends. She had a good many opponents. And she defied her enemies, and she did very little to placate her friends. She was a monument of indiscretion. The indiscretion taking the form of trying to get her own way at any time, in season, out of season, regardless of what anybody else was doing or wanted to do. All that had to give way before the onrush and the almost, irresistible impetus of Ethel's wishes and desires. I can only say that she had a great deal of difficulty over her compositions. She was a perfectionist. She demanded an inordinate amount of time for preparation, rehearsals, and didn't always succeed in getting them because she was not exactly the soul of tact in securing the desired results. In fact, quite the contrary. She generally succeeded in alienating the sympathy, if not the respect, of most people around her. She'd been of a milder type of character. She would have done a great deal more, and she'd have had infinitely more opportunities of hearing and of performance. Of course, today, if she were living, she'd be heard almost all the time, because with the growth of orchestras and the boundless activities of the British Broadcasting Corporation, it would be quite impossible to ignore Ethel. In fact, they wouldn't have had a chance of ignoring her. She'd have been on the doorstep of them all, from morning till night and from night till morning. But you must take everyone, by and large. And there is no doubt that Ethel was certainly one of the most remarkable women this country has ever produced, or any country has ever produced. She was a grand curiosity, and she was an ornament to society, using the word in its larger sense, and to the art of music as practiced then in England. She was a stubborn, indomitable, unconquerable creature. Nothing could tame her, nothing could daunt her. And to her last day, she preserved these remarkable qualities. And when I think of her as a grand person, a great character. I'm not qualified to express an opinion about her music. Anyway, if I were, I shouldn't give it. I never give my opinion about the music of my friends. I'm not brave enough. But about Ethel as a personality, there are no two opinions. She was one of the most remarkable people of her time, among men, among women, and there are many of us alive today who cherish her memory, and we do so with admiration, respect, and a great deal of love.
I'd like to complete that portrait of Ethel Smyth with a very brief extract from her music. Sir Thomas Beecham has spoken of Dame Ethel as being a perfectionist, and this minuet from Fête Galante, I think, happily illustrates that description.
Women composers today are a retiring lot, only emerging from their corners when anyone condescends to play their music. Ethel Smyth was far from retiring. She blasted her way through life loudly and courageously, protesting with immense force, wit, and good humor about the all-too-common male prejudice against women musicians. And so nearly, so very nearly, her operas gained for her a European reputation such as no other English composer, male or female, has enjoyed. She was cruelly unlucky. In this program, we can tell only a tiny part of her story. For every anecdote, there will be 100 crowded out, for she trailed anecdotes behind her wherever she went. Fortunately, she herself made some recordings for the BBC some 25 years ago, and we shall begin with a quotation from her most notable broadcast, her reminiscences of Brahms, whom she first met in 1877 when she was 19.
When I was a young girl, I studied music in Leipzig and almost immediately became, to all intents and purposes, the adopted child of a childless couple called von Herzogenberg, who were well known throughout the German musical world. She was always referred to by her contemporaries as Frau Liesl. In wholly blameless fashion, the master adored her, and when in Leipzig always stayed in the Herzogenberg's flat. There he was at his very best, and for his hostess's sake was very kind to me, whom in semi-jocular fatherly style he called the child. Thus, for 7 years, I associated with him as freely as with a seldom seen, rather alarming uncle. Towards the close of an entertainment in his honour, entertainments that lasted into the small hours, Brahms the while devouring ham rolls, washed down with glass upon glass of beer and cup after cup of strong black coffee, a sort of after the battle atmosphere would often hang over the scene. Some of the injured had been removed on stretchers. Others were licking their wounds, brooding over a sortie that had gone awry, and hoping for a chance of making good before the lights were turned down. Now surely it betokens a certain lack of simplicity, let us put it at that, in the soul of a great man, if all he can do in response to some stammered outpouring is to stroke his grey moustache, gaze fixedly at his interlocutor, and say, "And did the gracious lady indeed have all those lovely feelings, thanks to my poor quartet? And where did they lodge? Beneath the little blue shawl, or perhaps under the cocky bird in her hat?" This was a fragment of conversation I myself overheard. What particularly infuriated me was his views about women. We all know the Kaiser's dictum that we are out of place everywhere, except in the nursery, the kitchen, and in church. But there was something still more offensive in the view upheld by Brahms, who, as bachelor and artist, preferred to look upon women as playthings. And what angered me most, confronted by a pretty face, he had a way of pouting out his lips, stroking his moustache, and staring, exactly as a little boy stares at tartlets in a confectioner's window. Yet, of this coarseness, there is not the faintest trace in Brahms the artist. Can one think of purer depths of tenderness than well up in his music? Even as regards women, the words he chose for his songs betoken a very different strain to the one he was wont to exploit in his life and conversation. Rather a puzzle, isn't it?
As early as 1893, Ethel Smyth produced what some people think her masterpiece, the Mass in D. Its poor reception confirmed her belief that she must have better hopes of success abroad, especially as her ambition was to write operas. For her first onslaught on German opera houses, she inadvertently chose the Boer War period, when the German press was showing quite astonishing hostility towards this country. Berlin gave Der Wald 5 performances, but organized catcalls at the end of the first one left it no chance of success. Ethel Smyth used the more vitriolic criticisms to wrap up the golf clubs she had characteristically brought with her, and hurried home to England. As she herself remarked, quoting, she thought, Saint-Saëns, "It's bad when they don't perform your operas, but when they do, it's far worse." The words of Der Wald had been written by Henry Brewster. H.B., as she usually called him, was a sensitive and highly intelligent writer who lived much of his life abroad. And when his wife died in the early 1890s, he and Ethel Smyth thought for a time of marrying, though nothing came of it. Brewster also wrote the libretto of her next opera, The Wreckers. This was set in Cornwall in the 18th century, when fishermen working at night in stormy weather would lure ships onto the rocks by misplacing lights and then plunder the resulting wrecks. Bruno Walter has recorded his memories of this work.
It began in 1907. I was a conductor at the Vienna Opera, And one day, Gustav Mahler, its director, sent word to me I should listen to an English woman composer who wanted to acquaint us with her opera, The Wreckers. And there Ethel Smyth appeared, most unattractively dressed, with the vocal score of her opera under her arm. She sat down on the piano and began to sing with the typically unmelodic voice of a composer. But hardly had I taken in the astounding experience for 10 minutes that I rushed over to Mahler's office and told him, "This woman is a real composer. Her opera impresses me deeply by its original musical language as well as by its dramatic power." I almost implored him to come over and share with me that unusual experience. Unfortunately, he was not free. So I returned alone. I continued to listen, and then I began to talk with her. I took her to my home, and we found so much in common as musicians and as human beings that from this first contact on, there began a friendship that lasted until the end of her life. I remember to have been particularly fond of the prelude to the second act of her opera. She called it On the Cliffs of Cornwall. I still carry in my memory the unique, elementary sound of that composition, in which seemed to be caught the salty atmosphere of the ocean and the austere character of the barren island where the tragic events of the drama took place, whose protagonists were the heroic lovers, Mark and Thurza. I still have in my ear the ecstatic expression with which she sang for me the climax of their duet, which culminates in kindling the fire that should be seen from afar over the stormy seas. The heroic drama and its wild atmosphere were just what appealed to Ethel Smyth's innermost nature. Whenever I thought of her, her soul appeared to me as a flame, burning high, like that in the Wreckers. I think it was in 1909 that I conducted the performance of the Wreckers at Covent Garden Theatre, invited by Thomas Beecham.
Here is the overture to the Wreckers in a performance conducted by Ethel Smyth herself. The concert version includes, near the end, the hymn sung just after the curtain has gone up by fishermen on their way to church. Ethel Smyth's niece, Ethel Davidson, remembers her well in the early 1900s.
When Dame Ethel entered a room, the whole atmosphere seemed to be charged with electricity. She was the most vital and dynamic person I have ever come across. She had a very exhilarating effect upon people, and as a sick friend once remarked to her, "One has to be very well to enjoy you, Ethel." Her chief characteristic was an unbounded capacity for loving, and what she gave to her family and friends, none of those who experienced it are ever likely to forget. At the same time, she could be very ruthless in her criticisms. Her sense of humor was supreme, and she loved telling stories against herself. Now and then, however, her very quick and intelligent brain used to stall like an engine, and she looked perfectly blank while the rest of us were laughing at some joke. Then suddenly she caught on, the engine clicked into gear again, her face lit up with a radiant smile, and she joined in the general mirth. This brain stoppage became known amongst the family as having an Ethel.
When the suffragette movement got into its stride, Ethel Smyth was in the van helping it along. All her life she was a vociferous feminist. Dr. C.S. Lang remembers a suffragette meeting in the Albert Hall at which he was the only man present.
The organ was to have been played by the first woman FRCO in the country, Mrs. Mary Layton. And on the day itself, Dame Ethel Smyth came flying over to the Royal College to see Sir Walter Parrott because Mrs. Mary Layton was taken ill and couldn't play. And Ethel Smyth rushed into the concert hall where I was having an organ lesson. And she said, "Sir Walter, I must have an organist at once." So Sir Walter said to me, "Go on, off you go." And of course the chance I'd been longing for to play that Albert Hall organ. And so I went over, and she'd composed a march which all these women were going to sing. The whole Albert Hall was crammed with these suffragettes. And we had a rehearsal of the march. I played the organ, which I was longing to do, of course. Well, in the middle of the meeting, a message was handed to me to say that they suspected that some anti-suffragists were hidden inside the organ. Would I kindly put on full power and blow them out? Well, I did, but nothing came out. And I was told by my friends afterwards, they all knew at the Royal College that I was going to do this, because I was so excited about it. I was told that the organ was heard at the bottom of Exhibition Road.
You might like to hear a few bars of the famous March of the Women. Most of Ethel Smyth's relations were either in the army or married to it, and not all of them approved of these suffragette goings-on. For instance, her niece, Violet Eastwood, recalls the front door bell ringing late one night and the parlour-maid announcing that Miss Smyth had arrived. Her father asked what on earth she thought she was doing there at that time of night, and she said she'd broken some windows in a government building and the police were after her, and could she stay there and hide from them. Miss Eastwood's father was furious and said she'd have to leave by the first train in the morning, for he wasn't going to get himself mixed up with the police. Like many other suffragettes, Ethel Smyth finished up in prison. She herself described the occasion in a pre-war scrapbook broadcast, though regrettably she does not reach the climax.
At exactly 5:30 one memorable evening in 1912, relays of women produced hammers from their muffs and handbags and proceeded methodically to smash up windows in all the big London thoroughfares, Piccadilly, Regent Street, and so on, inspired by the knowledge that exactly at that moment Mrs. Pankhurst was opening the ball with a stone aimed at a window of 10 Downing Street. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Pankhurst was not a cricketer, and in spite of much practice in my garden, her stone fell harmlessly in the area of number 10. But her companion's stone did its duty nobly. Nearly 200 women were arrested that evening. Some of us had been told off to attack private houses, and I had begged for Mr. Lulu Harcourt because of an infuriating remark of his, he was Colonial Secretary, to the effect that if all women were as pretty and as wise as his own wife, we should have the vote tomorrow. I walked into Berkeley Square, where he lived, and before his house, he being in the government, stood a policeman.
During her 6 weeks in Holloway Jail, Ethel Smyth claimed to have conducted her March of the Women with a toothbrush brandished through the bars of her cell on the 3rd floor. For a year or more, she had given all her energy to the suffragette movement, and now she felt she must get back to her main job in life, composing. Also, she badly needed a rest. First, she went to the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland, for she thought of setting Synge's Riders to the Sea and wanted to get the atmosphere. But soon she came to feel this was too grim a subject after all the harrowing times she'd just been through. She must write a comic opera. And with typical effrontery, she picked on a short story by W. Jacobs, The Boatswain's Mate, and wrote the libretto herself. The late Sir Ronald Stores has recorded his memories of this period.
I like to think of her in Cairo, whither I enticed her in 1914 to finish her opera, The Boatswain's Mate, playing at the age of 56 several drastic sets of tennis, and afterwards in a long white woolen overcoat, holding her own no less easily with a mixed bag of foreign diplomatists and Egyptian pashas. Egypt came at the climax of her suffragette epoch, when she wore a large brooch designed with the grill of a prison to remind the world that she'd hunger-struck and done 6 weeks for her militancy. You wanted to watch your step with her in those days, laying desperately off any kindred inflammable topic. True, it was delightful hearing her improvise at the piano ribald cantatas based upon Lord Cromer's anti-suffragette speeches, with the refrain, "They are putting back the clock 20 years," enriched by strings, brass, and percussion, hummed, howled, or sneeze-stamped and banged by herself. But it was anxious work taking her to luncheon with Lord Kitchener, who never could see what women wanted to vote for. And what a relief when she tuned down, not from any respect for his ridiculous ignorance, but for fear you might lose your job if I'd let drive. The worst came when in my flat a too-womanly woman doctor was against the vote because women's proper sphere was the home. Ethel tautened, fixed her with a basilisk stare, and answered that women fighting for their rights, welcome supporters, could tolerate prejudiced male adversaries, but traitors, never. And the poor amiable traitress burst into tears.
Ethel Smyth used the March of the Women in the overture to The Boatswain's Mate, because, as she put it in a letter to Mrs. Pankhurst, Mrs. Waters gave those two men what for in such splendid style that I think the opera deserves that touch, don't you? Touting the score round Europe in the summer of 1914, she must have been at her most persuasive. As she wrote in her book, Beecham and Pharaoh, by the middle of June, the goal was touched towards which I had been stealthily moving for 8 years. The work by which I stand or fall, the wreckers, was to be dragged out of the pit again and would, as produced by Bruno Walter after Christmas in Munich, be safe, so I believed, for all time. And without hesitation, the director at Frankfurt am Main had accepted and fixed the premiere of The Boatswain for 14 days after the wreckers' production, My wild dream had come true. In the coming winter, 2 of my operas would be running simultaneously at 2 of the first opera houses on the continent. And oh, how the gods, seated up aloft and looking on, must have split their sides. August the 4th, 1914, dashed all her hopes, and the chance was not to come again. But the Boatswain's Mate did get performed eventually in London with Sir Thomas Beecham conducting. You might like to hear a record of What If I Were Young Again, sung by the original Mrs. Waters, Rosina Buckman. The record is pre-electric, but you will forgive its quality.
What if I were young again, fair and gay? What if I were young again, just for today? For hope and in glory fitting, with good friends of thine lips written. Ah, well I know, if my heart were still young, where my thoughts would belong. When the long day's work was done, night coming fast, all the tired world was gone, silence at last. The book in the darkness sitting, the sun was the one who kept it. With bright heart, Lord, I would feel the love what I know well.
That refrain comes from a folk tune associated with the ballad of Lord Randall, and one of Cecil Sharp's folk songs, The Keeper, also finds a place in the Boatswain. But this interest in English folk song is exceptional. Ethel Smyth's style was for the most part much less English than that of her contemporaries. At a time when people were coming to believe that only folk song influence could produce a native school of composers, the obviously Germanic style of her music may well have done as much to retard her success as the fact that she was a woman. Yet she herself, with her passion for foreign travel and dogs and games, was almost a caricature of an Edwardian Englishwoman. Here once more is Sir Ronald Storrs.
Dress problems troubled her but little, and she was never really at her ease, out of tweeds, tailor-mades, or tennis clothes.
Everyone was struck by her clothes. For instance, at a somewhat later date, Avril Wood, a daughter of Sir Henry Wood.
Dame Ethel was by no means clothes conscious, and for a good many years she appeared in the same brocade evening dress every time she conducted one of her own works. I remember that on several such occasions in the artist room at Queen's Hall before the concert, my mother pointed out to her that her dress needed lifting slightly on the shoulders, whereupon Ethel would dive into her coat pocket and produce 2 large safety pins. Catching hold of each side of her dress, she would bunch it together into folds, haul it up, spear it with the safety pins, which must subsequently have been visible to quite a large section of the audience, and march triumphantly onto the platform.
Nevertheless, despite her unsmartness, Ethel Smyth moved in the very highest circles, numbering the Princess Eugenie among her closest friends, and she had dined with Queen Victoria and the Kaiser. With her numerous army connections, it was natural that she should live most of her life in the Aldershot area. The people she moved among were far removed from the Chelsea and Bloomsbury sets. As Sir Ronald Storrs charmingly put it,
At the first performance of her Mass in D, her box at the Albert Hall was loyally filled with hunting friends who gave the music a respectful hearing.
but some at least of her friends were musicians. Here once more is Avril Wood.
Dame Ethel was a fairly frequent visitor to our home in Hertfordshire when I was a child, and she would arrive for the weekend, a remarkable figure in a long coat and skirt, collar and tie, and one of her famous tricorn hats, clutching as her only luggage a rather battered cardboard dress box, loosely tied with string. My father and mother adored her, but she must certainly have been a rather exhausting guest. she invariably came down to breakfast armed with a long strip of paper on which she had jotted notes, anything up to 30, of points which she wished to discuss there and then with my father. Such matters as, when was he going to give a performance of The Prison? This would lead to a discussion about Henry Brewster, with whom she always assured us her relations were entirely platonic. Would he check with her the parts of the violin and horn concerto? Why had he done nothing about getting another hearing for the Mass? My father bore most patiently with this catechism, but my mother and my sister and I would exchange despairing looks, for we knew we were condemned to utter silence, and that breakfast would trail on for an hour or more. Dame Ethel was a tremendously keen tennis player, an enthusiasm entirely shared by my father, and whenever possible and they could get my sister and me, or could lure 2 other unsuspecting guests, they would play a spirited game of doubles. My father, clad in rather tight and wrinkled white flannels and a spotted bow tie, was rather a rabbit on the court. Dame Ethel, on the other hand, in a white blouse, a long dark serge skirt, and a wide straw hat with a huge velvet bow, plunged about our hard court with tremendous zest and energy. She had a fast and sneaking underarm service, and as she served she would exhort my father with shrill cries to run up to the net and smash the return, a manoeuvre I may say he very rarely achieved.
Her niece, Ethel Davidson, remembers the enthusiasm with which she took up golf.
She went to North Berwick and lived there for a time, having lessons from David Grant. She became madly keen and wrote letters every day describing the games she'd had and her clubs. And then she came down and she joined the Woking Golf Club, where later on a friend built her a house. And she lived there and played golf every day.
That house at Woking was quite a curiosity. Sir Adrian Boult describes it as
that wonderful establishment outside Woking that we all used to enjoy visiting, full of great sheepdogs and golf clubs and bicycles and things. And there was she in the middle with an Irish maid occasionally producing excellent food. It was quite an experience to go down there.
Herbert Van Tall visited the house over the publication of one of the numerous and immensely readable books of reminiscences she wrote in her 60s and 70s.
To be invited to lunch at Dame Ethel's was always an adventure. She lived in a small modern house named Coyne at Woking, facing her beloved golf links. It was pleasantly segregated from her neighbours, so that Dame Ethel could practice making noises on her hunting horn with impunity, an instrument she enjoyed and succeeded in playing. Coyne was no architectural masterpiece from the outside, but it was full of that great woman's personality when you entered the sitting room. I remember on my first visit how anxious I was to be punctual for luncheon. I need hardly have worried. When the door was opened, her companion housekeeper looked at me and asked, "Have you brought Pan's medicine?" "Who is that?" came a piercing voice. "It's the vet," was the reply, "but he's forgotten the medicine." So I then joined the chorus and said I was merely Dame Ethel's publisher. After greeting Dame Ethel, we were told the potatoes were not done, so we adjourned to look at the golf course. I nearly fell over, I think, Pan 4, one of her enormous and rather smelly sheepdogs, of whom she wrote about in a most moving and admirable little book called Inordinate Affection. At the time I visited her, we were planning a book called Beecham and Pharaoh, the first half being a study of Sir Thomas, who was a great admirer of hers and who had conducted her opera The Wreckers. As to Pharaoh, this half of the book dealt with Dame Ethel's adventures in Egypt, where she composed her one-act opera The Boatswain's Mate. Actually, it was over the suffragette movement that I first met Dame Ethel. She had written a book called Female Pipings in Eden, which contained a long chapter on Mrs. Pankhurst. Dame Ethel had included a number of letters which she had received from Mrs. Pankhurst, but she had unfortunately failed to ask permission to print them, with the result that Miss, later Dame Christabel Pankhurst, came down on her for infringement of copyright. There was a battle royal in our offices in Covent Garden, where the two ladies met, culminating in umbrellas being raised and Dame Ethel's voice being heard loud above the din of the porters.
Mr. Van Tall sums her up in the following curious words, which could by no stretch of the imagination be applied to any other composer who ever lived.
But that was Ethel Smyth, royalty or conductors. throwing stones in the cars of the suffragettes, shedding her underwear in the middle of a golf course because she was hot, cycling to a party, changing into evening dress in the garden, and hanging her tweeds on the nearest tree before dining with the Empress Eugenie.
A program about Ethel Smyth would hardly be complete without one of the more outrageous anecdotes that are remembered of her. Sir Adrian Boult had what must have been a peculiarly embarrassing train journey with her.
Dame Ethel was nothing if not a pioneer, and she was the person who invented tissues about 30 years before they were on the market. I remember traveling down with her to Epping Forest to spend a weekend with her at her sister's home there. She had a bad cold, and as we got into the train at Liverpool Street, I was highly embarrassed when she produced a long string of paper with very obvious perforations at intervals down it, and said this was much the tidiest and cleanest way of blowing your nose when you've got a bad cold. And the bits of paper, as they were torn off, disappeared out of the window or under the seat or somewhere.
We have digressed to touch on some of the less important characteristics of this extraordinary woman. Let us return now to what matters more, her music. In particular, to her remarkable Mass, written at the start of her career. Sir Adrian Boult conducted it in Birmingham in 1924.
It's a most impressive work. Of course, she's thinking a great deal of the Beethoven Mass in D, but it has got moments of very great sincerity and beauty. And I very much enjoyed, I was very much thrilled by the performances we gave. There were two. After the Birmingham one, we all went to London as the guests of her sister, Mrs. Hunter, and in London we did it again with the Queen's Hall Orchestra, which Sir Henry Wood had kindly arranged should be available. Doing a composition by Ethel Smyth, it's a task quite different from that of any other composer. We met first, I suppose, 6 months or longer before the performance. I took a great many of the choral rehearsals myself, and we had a hectic correspondence. In fact, I think probably for the last 2 months before the performance, I had a postcard every day dealing with some detail that she'd thought of or some new idea. I'm afraid goaded rather at the final orchestral rehearsal. She was in the gallery, and I shouted up to her, "How fast do you want this movement to go today, Dame Ethel?" And she was a bit changeable. She hadn't got, of course, a tremendous power of organization of a big structure. I think it's true to say that that quality is rare in the female sex. She had it probably as well as anyone did. But it was really when she was linking her music to something literary, like the text of the Mass or the text of an opera, that the thing was best. Mind you, I think she was an unequal composer. The Mass contains a great deal of the best of her. Another work, choral work that I did, The Prison, which by the by was thought of very highly by Donald Tovey. He did it in Edinburgh, and we did it in London with the Bach Choir. But we did get rather tired of it, or tired of bits of it, by the time we got to the performance. On the other hand, there are many shorter sketches of hers that I think are magnificent. In particular, I remember the Cliffs of Cornwall, the prelude to the third act, I think it is, of the Wreckers. It's a magnificent picture of what it says, the Cliffs of Cornwall.
It will be remembered that Bruno Walter also thought highly of the Cliffs of Cornwall, and it's sad that there should be no recording of it. Instead, here is a recording made in the presence of the composer by Sir Adrian Boult of her 2 interlinked French melodies, a short orchestral piece taken from her last opera, Entente, cordiale. her 70s, Ethel Smyth still found work for her pen, though it was words she usually wrote rather than music. Her satire is as brisk and funny as ever. For instance, her inquiry into the BBC's refusal to have women cellists in its newly formed orchestra, though it was apparently thought quite proper for women to play any other instrument. It was something that the BBC should allow women musicians at all. Many orchestras didn't, although they might let a woman harpist slip through, probably because, as Ethel Smyth put it, the harp is a cumbrous and rather unlucrative instrument. But by this time, her main worries were no longer musical ones. As her niece, Miss Davidson, put it,
it was tragic to watch increasing deafness gradually closing down upon her. She was unable any longer to compose or listen to music, as all the sounds became distorted, and latterly she declared she hated music.
Ethel Smyth died in 1944, aged 86. What had she accomplished? In one of her last important books, Female Pipings in Eden, she brilliantly summarized the special difficulties that faced the woman composer. Many of them still exist, and some of them are still due to male prejudice. Insofar as these difficulties and this prejudice have been reduced, the thanks of the not inconsiderable number of women who get their music broadcast today, even if only occasionally, should be expressed to the shade of Ethel Smyth. She did not win all her battles, but she won some of them. Possibly her prose accomplished more than her music. As a prose writer, she was way ahead of any other composer who ever lived, bar Berlioz, and it might be that her reminiscences live at least as long as her music. You cannot read her books and forget them. May we end with two tributes. From Sir Thomas Beecham.
There is no doubt that Ethel was certainly one of the most remarkable women this country has ever produced, or any country has ever produced. She was a grand curiosity, and she was an ornament to society, using the word in its larger sense, and to the art of music as practiced then in England. Ethel had a good many friends. She had a good many opponents. And she defied her enemies, and she did very little to placate her friends. She was a monument of indiscretion. The indiscretion taking the form of trying to get her own way at any time, in season, out of season, regardless of what anybody else was doing or wanted to do. She was a stubborn, indomitable, unconquerable creature. Nothing could tame her, nothing could daunt her. And to her last day, she preserved these remarkable qualities. And when I think of her as a grand person, a great character. And there are many of us alive today who cherish her memory, and we do so with admiration, respect, and a great deal of love.
And Bruno Walter.
I am grateful that destiny has granted me the friendship of this great woman and genuine musician.
That tribute to Ethel Smyth was introduced by Denis Quilley.